Welcome back to this session of the Civic Forum. My name is Rory Truex. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics and School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. And I thank you all for coming. We've had 10 sessions now where we've talked about different aspects of democracy. But today is the session that I've been thinking about for quite some time. Today, we're going to be speaking with some of the leading experts on democratic erosion and hearing their point of view about the state of democracy in the United States. Before we get started, I did just want to remind folks of the ethos of this initiative, which is that this is a pro-democracy space. It's not meant to be a partisan space focused on the Democrats or the Republicans, but really about thinking the bigger picture about our democracy in ways that can be protected and strengthened. I should also say that today I'm operating in my personal capacity. So everything I say represents my personal views and does not represent the views of Princeton University. And that same statement goes for all of my other guests as well. So first, we're joined by Adam Przeworski in the lower right corner. Adam is a professor emeritus at New York University. He's one of the leading scholars of democratization. I'm currently teaching a course in comparative politics, and there are literally whole weeks of the syllabus that are mostly Przeworski. So we are grateful for Adam to be joining us. Second, we have Sue Stokes. Sue Stokes is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. She's also the president of the American Political Science Association and the head of the Chicago Center on Democracy. Sue has recently published a book. Sue, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it is out now for sale, called The Backsliders: Why Leaders Undermine Their Own Democracies. So we're excited to have her insights. Third, we have in the lower left corner, Daniel Ziblatt, who's a professor in the Department of Government at Harvard. Daniel is an expert on democratic backsliding and has co-authored a number of books with the person to his right, Stephen Levitsky, who's also a professor in the Department of Government at Harvard. And the two of them, I don't know if this is annoying to you all, but Levitsky and Ziblatt, it's become a pair. And Dan, as someone with the last name of Z, I wonder if that ever bothers you, that you always go second. But either way, a tremendous co-authoring team, and have written the very important book, How Democracies Die, which I'm sure many of you have read, and also Tyranny of the Minority, which is a sequel, both about democratic erosion in the United States. So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate you joining me. And today I'd like to just start. We're going to try to start in a pit of despair and end on a note of optimism, as is our way. We'll see if we ever get to that optimistic part. But I wanted to just give you a short time each, about 3 minutes, just to talk a little bit about the moment we're in. And in particular, what has surprised you about the politics of the last several months? You're all very familiar with democratic erosion in different contexts. You have different regional expertise. But what is striking or unusual about what you're seeing with democratic erosion under the Trump administration? And Adam, we're going to start with you.
Well, I am totally surprised. And the reason is that we have very well established historical patterns in which we try to explain why democracies thought in discrete terms, dictatorship, as opposed to dictatorship or autocracy or whatever, non-democracies. We have very robust empirical patterns which predict that democracy should not be under threat in a country like the United States, country with high per capita income, with long democratic traditions, etc., etc. Now, the results, specific results, depend a little bit on what you put in these models, but they are extraordinarily robust, very well established. As a matter of fact, I would claim that the finding that democracies don't fall in high-income countries is perhaps the most robust finding we have in political science. My own models predict that the probability that democracy would discretely fall in the United States is of the order of 1 in millions of country years. And yet, more, we cannot quite quantify backsliding, so we don't have statistical models. But as I look around the world, I again don't think that democracies should be subject to erosion in countries which have the per capita income and democratic traditions of the United States. And in fact, in similar countries, Western European countries, there is no backsliding. So I am totally surprised.
I think what's been most surprising to me in the last 8 months, so under the second Trump administration, is we've gone from backsliding via stealth to open autocratization. It's no longer stealthy. That those of us who were sort of following the literature in this space and just following what was happening were struck, I think, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that a lot of the cases of elected prime ministers and presidents who started to aggrandize their power, undermine the power of co-equal institutions, raise questions about the integrity of elections and so forth. They did so in a way that did not announce by any stretch of the imagination that they were interested in undermining democracy. They were presumably pro-democracy. They were just attacking institutions that weren't working well, that were corrupt and so forth. And that was consequential because it meant that citizens and all kinds of actors in their countries really weren't very sure what was going on. And that was used very much to the advantage of these leaders. In fact, Adam and my colleague, Zhou-Chan Luo, have a very nice paper that shows that if there's uncertainty about where you are in this process of losing the ability to kick leaders out of office, and you kind of like what they're doing slowly, a bit at a time, so you slowly kind of give away your ability to kick them out, the ability to hold them to account via elections, you may end up at a moment when you want to kick them out and you can't any longer. And so that was important insight about how stealth worked to the advantage, but it's not stealthy anymore. It's quite open. In the United States, there's no stealth. There's no mystery about the grab for power. Now, of course, the language is not that of we're undertaking autocratization, but open flouting of the rule of law, open ending of free speech. Freedom of the press is an absolute crisis today in the United States, absolute crisis. It's as much controlled by a partisan FCC as the Polish press was by a monitoring board that was put in place by the peace government. Academic freedom is very much under stress. We have shifted our international alliances so that they implicitly support autocratic countries abroad. And I could go on. So that's been a surprise, and it's worth thinking about what are the strategies for resistance, given that we're out of the world of stealth and into a world of open erosion. Let me just say a couple more things. I just wrote a book called The Backsliders. We use the language of backsliding and democratic erosion. I've heard the phrase breakdown of democracy recently, and I'm beginning to think that that's a better word in the United States. Now, Daniel and Steve wrote a wonderful book, as you mentioned, How Democracies Die. So die is a pretty stark word. But I think that, erosion doesn't, just as we're not in a world of stealth, we're not in a world of kind of slow moving towards something that looks less democratic. We're really at a moment of breakdown. Doesn't mean we can't come back. But I think that's where we are. And those things have been extremely surprising to me.
Thank you, Sue. And I would just actually plug, I saw Brendan Nyhan, who's a colleague of ours at Dartmouth, who does work on the Bright Line Watch, which tracks democratic erosion. And he's done some interviews recently where he actually pushes against this term backsliding or even erosion, because it's a passive voice, right? So something is happening to democracy. It takes away the agency from the people who are doing it. And it's also a term we use as political scientists, but it's not one that really has taken hold in the public. And so thinking about other ways of describing what's going on, whether it's an authoritarian power grab, something of that nature, might make things more clear. Dan, please.
Great. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I agree both with my colleagues' first opening comments. And I'll return to something that Adam said. I mean, I do think, given our cross-national knowledge of how the past century of the fate of democracies look, this is utterly surprising, given what we know. Wealthy democracies, old democracies should survive. And I think what it does is, it kind of raises a paradox in my mind, because it is totally surprising in that respect. But in another respect, it's not surprising, in the sense that, I think that this was sort of these plans that have been implemented over the last 8 months were advertised pretty clearly. You had unified party government. And so at some level, like, of course, this is being implemented, or there's a project underway. I think the other part of this, so I'm not quite sure how to square the fact that it's at some level totally surprising and another level not surprising. I think one thing that one way of helping sort of undo that paradox, partly at least, is that less surprising is the attempt to implement something that was promised. And much more surprising is the degree to which societal leaders, thinking here of corporate leaders, business leaders, media leaders, have essentially surrendered or abdicated and allowed this to happen, or at least failed or made a series of serious miscalculations in terms of what the appropriate response to this ought to be. And so that's been surprising to me. But I think one can chalk it up to some degree to miscalculation, a kind of not willingness by key civil society leaders to take the threat seriously enough. But if it is a miscalculation, this then kind of sort of reinforces the original paradox, which is the whole point of the premise that high GDP per capita should save you means that it should save you from miscalculations. It should save you from the fact that you have bad leaders or people making miscalculations. The whole point of the thesis of this kind of structural argument is that agents don't really matter that much. I mean, it's sort of, to twist on the kind of Madison line that if men were angels, we wouldn't need government. I mean, at some level, if we don't, given our theories of and what we know about the relationship between wealth in particular, and as well as age of democracy and the stability of democracy, these miscalculations shouldn't have landed us in the spot that we're in, and yet they have. And so I think that's the thing that I'm sort of puzzling through. But at the end of the day, I think, I guess the main point I would make is that the effort to implement this project is not surprising. The fact that it's happened so quickly is certainly, is surprising to many. But I think, the only way to interpret this is that this is essentially year 10 of this project. We go back to 2016, not month 8 of the project. And so there's been a lot of learning. So there's an effort to implement this authoritarian project. And I think what's really baffling to me continuously is the kind of willingness of societal actors to miscalculate, to say, well, we can save ourselves by kind of not pushing back, even though that's been shown again and again not to work. So that's the thing that I'm puzzling.
Dan, thank you for that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about elite opposition. And I wanted to plug your recent piece in Foreign Affairs, which talks a lot about this issue where elites representing different institutions, whether it's a university, a firm, think that by negotiating and maybe by giving some concessions that will save them. And there's something inherently tragic about that because it only invites further power moves. And so that's another one of the issues that we're seeing happen in a lot of different industries. Steve, thank you for being patient.
I ordinarily like batting cleanup, but it's pretty hard to follow Przeworski, Stokes, Ziblatt. They've taken all the good points. So I'm just I'll be quick and reiterate a couple of points. One, I'm with Sue in that the speed and the aggressiveness of this authoritarian turn. Daniel's absolutely right that this was advertised, that they're almost everything they're doing, they said they were going to do. But I did not anticipate just how quickly and radically they'd move on so many fronts. I mean, this it is not an exaggeration, I think, to say that the Trump administration has been much more radically authoritarian than the first year of the Chavez government in Venezuela, than the Orban government in Hungary, than the AKP government in Turkey. This is even by comparative standards in the 21st century a real authoritarian blitzkrieg. Secondly, to pick up on Daniel's point, to me the most surprising thing, but this links back to Adam's point as well, is how is the fecklessness of our elite and societal response. There are a lot of different theories for why rich democracies never break down. My own pet theory focuses a lot on the dispersion of resources in society and the wealth and power of civil society and the private sector and the media. We have a very muscular civil society, one that is punching way below its weight, or that's not punching back. And the degree of elite acquiescence and elite appeasement, as Daniel said, from Republican leaders to many Democratic Party leaders to university leaders, to law firms, to private sector, to media, to me has been pretty stunning, and it's something to be explained. I think as a society, particularly given the institutions that we have more than enough muscle to resist this authoritarian offensive. But so far, we've kind of remained on the sidelines.
And Stephen, picking up on that point, I think part of this might be that people just don't think it can happen here, so to speak, right? So there's this feeling that this isn't. There are still many folks who think that this is some normal democratic chapter. Sue, you talked a little bit about the kind of overt nature of the authoritarianism, but there are of course people in the Republican faction that overtly use authoritarian language. Like we think of so-called thought leaders like Curtis Yarvin. There was a debate: should the U.S. be run as a dictatorship? That was a debate that actually happened between Curtis Yarvin and a friend of mine, Glenn Weil. So there are overt discussions of authoritarianism on the right? But I think most people floating around the Trump administration would brush off that label, of course. We've seen this actually in the wake of Charlie Kirk's murder, people saying this is because you've labeled us fascist. So they actually, I think, for many of them, they don't view themselves as authoritarian. They view themselves as enacting the people's will. This is a government that came into power through a free and fair election. And there are a whole lot of people in the United States that view the government as a hostile force and welcome the destruction of the federal government in different ways. And so I'm curious how you all think about this tension.
That's not atypical. I mean, particularly since World War II, and especially since the end of the Cold War, very, very few autocrats describe themselves or even think of themselves as autocrats. But you listen to the language of really important players in this government, like Stephen Miller, Russell Vought, even J.D. Vance. Of course, they don't call themselves authoritarian. Yeah. Sure, they don't think of themselves as authoritarian. Their language is openly authoritarian. And even more so than many contemporary autocrats like Erdogan and Orban. So, I'll stop there and let others speak.
Rory, if I could jump in, I think that one of the agree completely with Steve. So they are not advertising themselves as authoritarians. They probably don't think of themselves as authoritarians. That what they're doing is straight out of authoritarianism, and so so there's a tension there. And I think one of the things that to keep in mind. So our colleague Milan Svolik, with co-authors and some other folks in the profession, have done a great job kind of linking partisan polarization to voters' willingness to tolerate, or some voters' willingness to tolerate or even embrace backsliding governments. I think that operates at the elite level as well. I think that there are many, members of Congress, probably justices on the Supreme Court, the vice president, who say to themselves, "Yeah, this isn't totally kosher, and this maybe is a little heavy-handed, but God forbid that the other side get back in power," because they persuade themselves that the other side is, at the very least out to get them, but also out to destroy American institutions and the American way of life, the way they think about it. So I think that partisan kind of, partisan polarization gives them a bit of a green light in their own minds to move ahead with an openly authoritarian project. I say openly, objectively authoritarian project, even if it's not announced as such.
Maybe we should clarify what that means, though, because we're kind of sort of reaching the conclusion that this is authoritarian without saying openly that's objectively authoritarian without really specifying what that means. I mean, so I think one very clear criteria is the use of political violence, and which is clearly unacceptable in a democracy on any side. But I think in addition to that, maybe less well appreciated, is the importance of political leaders condemning the use of political side, especially when it's on their own side, but on both sides. And I think that's where we're seeing some kind of slippage here. So in other words, there is an asymmetry in the response to political violence, in the sense that Democrats seem to be more willing to condemn political violence across the board whereas leading Republicans, maybe not all leading Republicans, but many, only condemn it when it's attacking them. And so I think that's something that is obviously very worrying. And that, and I think that's part of the thing. So that's one thing we might point to. Another thing we might point to is a willingness to go after the kind of neutral referees of the state and utilize them to go after your political opponents. And I think we've seen that in full display over the last 9 months. And so we could talk a lot more about that, but, and I imagine from the other side, people might say, well, the Biden administration did this too, and so on. And, maybe one could debate that, but I think even if one were to concede that, I think it's very clear that the what's happened over the last 9 months has been much more extensive than anything any Democratic administration has done, in living memory. So, going after political opponents, threatening them, arresting them, opening investigations of them. This is the stuff that doesn't matter if you're elected democratically. That doesn't give you that being elected democratically in a free and fair election doesn't mean that everything you then do after that means you're now democratic. Either you're following kind of basic democratic principles. So there's, one criteria of being a democratic politician is you are elected democratic, you accept election results. But the second is that once in office, you don't either use violence, condone violence, or use the state to go after your political opponents to tilt the playing field against them. So on those kind of very basic, and I think that's maybe what's when Sue says objective criteria, those are the kinds of things I think we have in mind.
Daniel, thank you for kind of clarifying that. And those definitions are outlined very cleanly in your book and the second book, The Tyranny of the Minority, where you talk about sort of the difference between a system party, a pro-democracy party, and a party that's fundamentally hostile to democracy itself. So I would encourage folks to read that. I wanted to touch on Stephen's point just about the pace and the number of actions that have unfolded in rapid succession. I think this is clearly part of the strategy, right? The news cycle is almost impossible to follow. Just this week, we've seen Jimmy Kimmel taken off the air in relatively short order following his remarks about Charlie Kirk. We've seen the continued targeting of opposition actors, the use of disguised repression to target political enemies. So there's just so much going on. And I think there's a natural human response, which is to tune out. I think a lot of people at this point are finding the news just so overwhelming, and they're having trouble making sense of it. Of all the different moves going on, what are the ones that seem the most consequential to you all? How do we separate the big moves from the noise and maybe even the distractions? And Adam, can we start with you on that question?
I think that I would like to return to something that Steve said, which is about the strength of quote-unquote civil society in the United States. We have the long tradition going back to Montesquieu, through Weingast's article, through Fearon article, which basically say whenever the government in some prominent way violates norms, constitutional or not, the people will rise in defense of the Constitution. Well, Trump is able to pick institutions one by one, yes? This law firm and that law firm without the American Bar Association reacting. This university or that university without the universities presenting some kind of a united front. This media and this media, he's able to pick basically, in technical language, he's able to use the prisoner's dilemma, yes, in which the institutions which are not targeted at any particular time think maybe we should get quiet and this way we'll avoid being targeted. And that, I think, creates the success of the administration, but maybe it also means that the civil society in the United States is not strong. Milei tries to do something like this. He gets 1 million people on the street. Well, he got 800,000, I think, a few days ago, yes? I think Argentine civil society is very strong. You pick a target in some particular way, and you get hundreds of thousands of people on the street. The French society, I think, has the tradition. The U.S. seems to be crumbling.
Would anyone like to react to that?
So I half agree with Adam and half disagree. There have well, so yes, has been, following what Daniel was saying, yes, there has been a surprising kind of, the metaphor we use is taking the knee of various institutions and leaders under pressure. On the other hand, the leverage that the government is able to exert is powerful. And so I don't find it so surprising that the head of Disney says we're gonna pull Jimmy Kimmel when there is a lot of money and a lot of a lot at stake in maintaining a good relationship with the government. And we've seen that with ABC, and and I don't think it's so surprising that some law firms facing a threat of loss of their security clearance and loss of a ton of business have also, I wish they didn't, but I don't think it's that surprising with that degree of leverage. We're studying, the American Political Science Association, we're studying universities in an era of democratic erosion, and we see these same kinds of attacks on universities all over the world when you have these kinds of governments in power. What we haven't seen anywhere except in the United States is the level of extortion. So, $400 million from Harvard because anti-Semitism, the amounts of money and all that's at stake involved and the numbers of people who can be adversely affected means that the government has enormous leverage. And so I think that's what happens. On the other hand, look for the helpers. So we have lawyers and legal aid organizations and organizations like the ACLU and Project Democracy and so on and so forth, who have really gummed up the works in important ways by going to court and undertaking legal cases and getting some slowing down at least of the efforts on the part of judges and on the part of the federal bench below the level of the Supreme Court. We've had protesters all over the country. They tend to be decentralized. Maybe they're harder to see, Adam, than when they're, marching in, I don't know, where do they go in central Paris? But we do have, weekly protests. I was recently in Portland, Oregon on a Saturday morning and found a group of people who looked a lot like me. They were kind of older white folks, looked relatively middle class, and they were out there with their signs, and that's happening on and on and on. And then you have, the president of Princeton University bravely, courageously coming out saying this can't be, we can't do this. And so I do think that there have been moments of resistance, and moments of resistance, folks who are under tremendous power and under tremendous pressure and under pressure to try to save their own institutions. So I don't think that civil society in the United States has crumbled. I think it's under stress, but there are pockets of resistance that have been in some ways effective.
I still think there's a puzzle though, Sue, because compared to other democracies, including certainly Argentina, which Adam mentioned, the U.S. is a very limited state. So the leverage that the U.S. state has, the economic leverage that the U.S. state has over the private sector and the media and society, it's real, it's demonstrated, but it's less than in most democracies. And we have we can debate about how to measure civil society, but we have a very well-resourced, well-endowed civil society. And so if it's that easy to bully Disney and Paramount and Paul Weiss and Columbia University, which it appears to be, but if it is, that raises the puzzle of why no elected governments in other Western democracies have done this over the last 75 years.
Can I ask Adam a question here, if I might?
Please. I think my job is mostly to get out of the way. So please interact with each other.
Yeah. So let's say that you're right, Adam, that actually it turns out American civil society, and Steve is maybe not as right, which is that American civil society is quite weak and it doesn't have the muscle. Is that something you would have thought before this, or is this something that only is being revealed in the moment as a result of the attack? And in either case, I mean, what is your sense of what that, why is it much weaker than either its reputation or that it appeared?
No, I'm surprised. I would not have thought that before. I mean, there may be something about the structure of the country, kind of geographical, political structure of the country is, namely, it doesn't have one capital in which most of the action is. And, bringing people to Washington, that's complicated. Protests in Portland are not visible to anybody across the country. So maybe there is something like this, but I'm surprised.
Just to be a little add an additional point here. I mean, by some metrics, civil society is doing okay, right? So the number of protests, the size of the protests, like No King's Day was among the largest single-day protests in American history. And so you could argue that the population, at least segments of the population, are reacting. I know people who are politically active that have never been active in their entire lives, but have now been awakened by what's going on. I think there's a sense of a question of, well, what is this for? Like, how is it going to affect change? What is the mechanism through which getting people in the streets is going to actually gum things up for this government? And so I think there are numbers, there is a awakening, I think, of civil society, and maybe that's one of the long-term benefits of the moment, is that it reinvigorates American civil society. It's almost like a military that hasn't been used in decades, right? So it's all the organizations are there, but it hasn't ever had to respond to this type of crisis, and now it's creaky, it's old, it's not, but maybe it will be reinvigorated. I don't know if anybody else shares that sentiment.
I'm concerned that we're now, after the events of last week, after the killing of Charlie Kirk, that we are in a period of kind of the denunciation stage, the kind of private denunciation stage, where many activists, conservative activists, have effectively been deputized to monitor and denounce the actions of organizations, movement leaders, all kinds of folks. And so that's going to put additional pressure on civil society actors to keep their heads down. Could I go back to the unlikeliness of the U.S. falling to authoritarianism? So when the main way that democracies fell was through military coups, it was very unlikely that wealthy countries experienced military coups. In my book and in collaborative research with Ila from Tec de Monterrey, we find a very robust relationship between income inequality and democratic backsliding or democratic breakdown of the kind that we're observing in the 21st century. That's an effect that we statistically just haven't been able to get rid of, and it means that the more unequal a country is, the higher its Gini, the more skewed its wealth distribution, the more likely it is to elect leaders who will go on to democracy. So that lifts the level of probability for the United States to about 9%, which is, not huge, but disturbingly big given what the stakes are, and a lot bigger than the numbers that you get, the probabilities you get when you look at models that mostly were designed to look at the impact, where the dependent variable included coups. And what's the effect of inequality? There are a bunch of them. Some of them have to do with the effects on popular opinion and on lower income folks' confidence in democratic institutions, the propensity for polarization, for partisan polarization. Some of them have to do with the effects on wealthy people and their views of the role of government and the role of poor people in their societies. Some of them have to do with distortions of markets in all kinds of ways. Think about the housing market, the scarcity of affordable housing in our country, and in many advanced democracies, which are very unequal because housing markets tend to cater to the highest income, to higher income folks, and that leaves undersupply of lower income. So there's just all kinds of reasons that the connective tissue between income inequality and democratic erosion is sort of thick and complex. But that is something that I think helps us understand why the early 21st century, in sort of late globalization period, which has produced inequality on a massive scale in many countries, both in the global north and the global south, why we're seeing a spate of democratic backsliding at this time.
Yeah, Sue, I think you gave a talk at Princeton several months ago where you had a nice sentence, and I'm going to butcher it, but it was something along the lines of investing in equality is like investing in democracy itself, right? It reduces the stakes of the game. In some sense, you could say that the stakes of our political system are just too high right now, and that's the reason why that makes the incentive for these sort of authoritarian grabs. I did ask a question. It's like I'm realizing this is like having the all-time best class. So I just say something and then the conversation goes. But I did ask a question which was not answered, and I think it does matter, which is, what of all the things happening, what's the one thing that's going on that really is most alarming to you, most concerning? Let's start with you, Steve, and then go to Dan.
I took a little bit of issue with your original question. You asked us to sort of separate the real dangers from the noise and the distraction. There is some noise and distraction, but there are also an awful lot of abuses of and sort of politicization and weaponization of the state that are worth worrying about. And so it's there aren't just one or two things to worry about. There are many things to worry about. I think my greatest concern, I'll list two. One is the politicization of the military. In the long run, if Trump is even halfway successful at that can be disastrous. But what many things keep me up at night these days, but the one that keeps me up most is the fact that the administration is learning the extent to which it can use emergency powers. This is one area where it seems the courts are least likely to check Trump. Almost every constraint that we have on executive power has some sort of a clause that in a state of in an emergency situation, this doesn't hold, and you can bypass Congress or bypass normal legislation. And the administration seems to be slowly learning that they can declare an emergency for anything, and they can probably get away with it. At the very least, the courts might stop them in the long run. But even there, I think the Roberts Court is extremely extremely reluctant to question the judgment to set a precedent for questioning the judgment of the executive in declaring an emergency. So I think the Trump team is circling around the key to dictatorship if they find it, and that will be declaration of emergency.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I mean, the only thing I would add, I mean, certainly the political violence, the rhetoric of violence is at some level the most worrying. But I don't think that fortunately has reached the stage yet, at least, that's at the very top. I mean, it's in terms of the scale of the threat versus the risk of the threat. I would say the scale of that, or the kind of significance of that threat, is certainly the most significant. But it's like, is it something that's going to happen immediately? I mean, I think the things that Steve, the kind of weaponization of the state, are much more worrying things. And I guess one thing I would say, I mean, one thing I would add that maybe it's not as obvious, is that I think that the court, and this comes from looking at how courts have responded to this in other places, and also how the court has responded to assaults on democracy in the past during the Jim Crow era. And there's a way in which the court is really concerned about preserving its own reputation, its own autonomy. And so there's a great temptation to kind of try to play a middle road here. And then, some instances give the administration a victory, in other instances not, or even when it kind of rules against the administration, to kind of do so in a half-hearted way that kind of doesn't allow for the full, and so they can say they've taken a stand, but not allow for a fully robust response. So I think the kind of mushiness in a certain way of how the court could respond to these things is the thing that I'm worried about, because it won't always be clear kind of where we are. I think also for the public, because we have courts complexity of our federal court system is the court rules, the circuit court rules one way, the Supreme Court delays, and so people forget that this even happened, and the kind of air of confusion around all of this is just something that I think is a sort of pathway for an executive to really abuse office. So I think the role of the court here is certainly one of the things I'm.
And I would just plug Adam Badanka, who is a colleague of ours at Stanford, is doing a lot of writing on Substack these days and has talked a lot about this idea that the courts are basically at war with themselves. And so we see the lower level courts pushing back against Trump at actually a pretty high rate, roughly 90%, and then the Supreme Court going the other way, roughly siding with Trump 90% of the time. So there's this, and all of that takes time. And as time passes, that's when actions continue to happen. So it doesn't quite matter that it gets gummed up in the courts because it does take so long. Dan, did you want to
give you an example? This is a historical example. So in the early 30s, while the democratic government was still in force in Germany, there was a declaration of emergency in the state of Prussia, which was run by the Social Democrats. The conservative government declared a state of emergency, sort of in a certain way, sort of under false pretenses, so that it could claim police powers and get rid of the Social Democratic cabinet. The state of Prussia filed a lawsuit. The court came in and intervened and basically sided with the state of Prussia, but then in its decision, although it sided with the state of Prussia, it didn't actually allow for the reinstallment of the democratically elected cabinet, and sort of just waited and stalled this out. And so what this did is it federalized police powers at the national level in the kind of very, very late democratic era, which then provided the kind of loaded gun for an autocrat once he got into power. So, this is the kind of way in which these kind of half-hearted, mushy decisions actually can be quite dangerous.
Adam, did you want to weigh in on any of this?
No, because I completely agree with Steve. I think this is an extremely dangerous situation in which the politicization and subordination of the military and increased political repression may be preparatory to a Reichstag fire incident and declaration of state of emergency and open force. I'm extremely pessimistic. I don't want to attach probabilities to that event, but I see it as a factor.
Agree 100% with what my colleagues have said. I would just add the kind of threat to vertical accountability, the threat that elections won't be able to be used to turn out of power governments and leaders who the public has decided should be turned out. So national level gerrymandering looks a lot like Hungary. The kind of sense that your vote won't count because the president says we're going to count votes different ways. We're going to allow different kinds of votes, different kinds of voting, taking the lead from Vladimir Putin of all people about how to make sure your elections are free and fair as the justification. So I'm very concerned that elections will stop being mechanisms of accountability.
So let's move forward and talk a little bit about opposition at the elite level, in particular the Democratic Party. And I said at the beginning that this is supposed to be an initiative that's nonpartisan. But at the same time, in order to oppose an authoritarian political movement, you need the opposition to be relatively strong and maybe even to win some elections here and there. There's a general sense, I think, among many people that the Democratic Party is a bit feckless right now. I've been reading your different writing, and you all have different ways of saying that type of sentiment. But if you could put on your political consultant hat for a second, what would you be telling Democratic Party leaders to do in this moment? How can they get their act together? Steve is literally shying away from the question, so maybe we'll start with Dan, who has a knowing smile.
No, laughing at Steve because he often says I'm not a political consultant. So when you said you're not, well, certainly it's just normal electoral politics at some level and trying to figure out how to win elections. I mean, one thing this whole kind of episode has reinforced to me is the importance of a Schumpeterian definition of democracy. I mean, at the end of the day, it's elections that are the thing that everybody's sort of hoping for, an election outcome, and that where there can be some rebalancing of power at the national level. So, I think one thing I would say is that, and Steve and I have spent a lot of time talking about this, that the Democratic Party politicians have, especially older ones, have come of age and developed a set of skills that have not particularly prepared them for this moment. Meaning that to be a politician in a stable democracy means you kind of win elections and you figure out how to pass legislation. And those skills may not be necessarily the exact skills that are necessary to defend a democracy, because it's not only about winning elections. It's also about drawing people's attention to the stakes of the battle and mobilizing people. And so, I'm not sure, how Democratic Party politicians can do that in terms of, but I think that's what's necessary. I mean, I think there's a need to recognize the scale of the threat and to understand that this is not just a kind of fight about winning the next election, but that there's even more at stake than that. In terms of what the messaging is, I mean, I don't know, I sort of want to shy away from it too, but I guess the one thing I would say is figuring out some way to link these questions of this idea that there has to be a trade-off between democracy and like kitchen table issues strikes me as kind of ill-conceived, and there has to be a way. This is much easier said than done, but I think it's important anyway, to link democracy, the issues of democracy that the four of us have spent our careers studying, to the kinds of other types of issues that voters also think about. I think voters do think about democracy and restrictions on their freedom. So I think that, to say that they don't is not right. I mean, it was one of the top rated issues among voters in 2024. But linking those issues to how this affects their lives is the thing to kind of figure out how to do, as a campaign messaging thing. That's what I would think. But, I think it's, you turn on C-SPAN and you watch Democratic members of Congress and they talk about, Trump is a dictator. They're sort of saying all the right stuff, but there's a way in which their actions aren't following from that rhetoric. And I think it's partly because they don't quite know what to do. And this gets back to this issue of not having the kind of appropriate skills of democracy activists, which at some level is what we also need. How's that for giving an answer that's not an answer at all?
No, that, you might get hired as a political, because every time I ask someone a version of that question, it's uncomfortable for political scientists to think this way. But Sue, do you have?
What I would just say is that part of the reason it's uncomfortable is that, this requires looking at data, focus groups and stuff like that. So in sort of a way, I'm just sort of shooting in the dark here a little bit because I haven't done it.
Yes, no, and it's going more on intuition. Steven,
can I give a non-consultant answer?
Please give any answer.
To put the U.S. case a little bit in comparative perspective and broader perspective, first of all, when in situations like this where a sort of populist authoritarian wins election and begins to abuse power, if you look at other cases, oppositions are destroyed. And I'm thinking about Peru and Venezuela and Ecuador and El Salvador and Serbia and a little bit Turkey, Hungary. Every one of these cases, oppositions are weak, discredited, fragmented, demoralized, in terrible shape. Compared to those cases, the U.S. Democratic Party is in great shape. There's a unified opposition. The party's not going to split. It is well organized. It continues to have a relatively strong brand despite the low approval ratings. It remains electorally competitive. If things don't go completely off the rails, has a very good chance of winning the next couple of elections. There's lots we can complain about, but in comparative perspective, the Democratic Party, compared to similar situated cases, is in the opposition, the electoral opposition, is in great shape. It remains unified and electorally viable. Secondly, and I don't want to come off as too much of an apologist for the Democratic Party, but this is a normal political party in a two-party system, a very heterogeneous, pragmatic, old party that suffered a terrible defeat in 2024 that surprised it. And it did in the first 6 months what normal parties do in democracies when they suffer unexpected defeats. They debated, they nursed their wounds, there was infighting, and the party has spent the last several months getting its shit together. Am I allowed to say that? Getting its crap together.
This is unsanctioned event.
Right.
You can
Princeton
say whatever you
I'm not
want.
speaking for Princeton here. Getting its shit together, trying to get its shit together. Parties do that, and it frankly usually takes major political parties years to get themselves together after losing an election. The problem is this is not a normal moment, so we're asking much more of the Democratic Party than they've been capable of delivering. But the way the Democratic Party behave, if you step back and look at it, is to be expected, and is actually the party's in better shape than in comparable cases.
Can I say, well, firstly, thank goodness we all have secure jobs and are going to need to be tried to hire it as political consultants. But I think that the Republicans may be taking false hope in the low approval ratings of the Democrats in polls because, there's no candidate. We just lost a whole bunch of elections. Obviously, the Democratic Party is undergoing a period of kind of intergenerational struggle. The older generation, as Daniel was saying, hasn't figured out how to communicate, how to adapt to the tension economy that we have, and so on. There's a lot to be sorted out there. There's a lot of real policy differences. I think there are real policy differences on average between older Democrats and younger Democrats on Israel, Gaza, and so on. On the other hand, I completely endorse what Steve just said, and we're beginning to see real auditions on the Democratic side for presidential candidacy. So my governor, J.B. Pritzker, Governor Newsom in California, they're in full audition mode. And how are they auditioning? Well, they're going after Trump like crazy, and they're pretty effective in quite different modes, right? So Pritzker is the sort of smart gravitas-ish guy, and Newsom is the smart aleck, and it's both of them are getting a lot of traction from that. So I don't expect that. Americans don't like political parties. We haven't liked the prospect of political parties since the founding. Too bad our Federalist authors didn't foresee political parties, because we would have avoided some problems in our Constitution if they had. It's natural not to like parties. So in a poll, somebody asks you how you feel about the Democratic Party. It doesn't surprise me that they poll pretty badly. But sit tight and wait.
No, I have some doubts about these views, to say. I don't remember the name of a Democratic campaign manager at one time. I think he meant Hillary Clinton, who advised when Trump was elected a second time, that the Democratic Party should do nothing and say nothing, and should wait for Trump to implode. And I think that to the extent to which the Democratic Party is a party and is capable of any strategy, I think that's the strategy. Basically, wait for Trump to commit electoral suicide. It may be a good strategy. I wouldn't advise anybody for it or against it. It may be a reasonable strategy. But I think what it means is that Democrats have nothing to say. They can resist, they can protest, they can object, but they have no positive proposal that's anywhere in the public forum, and perhaps deeper than that. There's nothing they can agree to. What is the positive message that they convey?
Can I just say that seems to be a broader problem of the center left in democracies globally? I can't think of a country in South America, in Western Europe, in North America where the center left has a project right now. It seems to be really pains me to say this, but the only political force in Western democracies that has a project, that has an ideology, that has something that motivates activists to get out of bed on Saturday morning is the far right.
I agree.
One thing I've thought of, I don't know if this is electoral strategy or maybe a oppositional governing strategy, which is, the American system is distinctive in the importance of its federal system, and as the federal government dismantles national institutes of health, the vaccination projects and so on, the health and human services, I wonder to what degree actually these Democratic governors, and any governor, in fact, should be focusing on building kind of a set of counter institutions and kind of reshifting power to the state level and having cooperation among states to provide alternative sources of funding for research, alternative sources of, and I think some of this is actually happening. I mean, some of the West Coast states have joined together to kind of oversee vaccinations and so on. So I think this kind of, I mean, number one, this is actually, if Democrats do come back into power at the federal level, having some kind of organization or structures of governance that are developing, so they don't simply disappear over the next 3 years, I think would be important. Number one. Number two, it also does offer an opportunity to offer something different. I mean, that this is, in order to offer something different, in part, you have to, I mean, it's useful to be in power. And there are these states where Democratic governors and actually unified democratic government is in power. And these are very successful states. And so in a way, these are the counter models that people should be focusing on that. I mean, that's one way of bridging this kind of governance as well as opposition electoral strategy.
And I think that there are differences in the Democratic Party and in social democratic parties and left of center parties in the advanced democracies. But I do think that there are visions and programs. I think one vision is reclaiming the identity as champion of workers and low economically marginal people, which the Democratic Party in the United States is by no means the only center-left party that lost that identity for reasons that Adam so eloquently articulated in an old book of his called Paper Stones, where parties can respond to incentives to kind of broaden their base. In this case, in countries like the United States, Great Britain, and the Nordic countries, to start appealing, in addition to appealing to working class folks, to also start appealing, broaden their base to college educated, more affluent city dwellers. And without meaning, I think, to give up being also the party that was in favor of social spending and a generous welfare state and so on. But the effect of making that shift was to lose that identity. And I think that identity needs to be reclaimed. And I think there are lots of voices in the Democratic Party and in social democratic parties around the world who understand that and are trying to do that. There are all kinds of resistances to it. In the United States, we have to work through how we do that without sounding like we've also, we're giving up on other kind of folks who are disfavored and marginalized by our society. We need to work that out. We need to work out how we take, do we take major corporate, huge money donations and somehow reclaim our position as a party of workers. One of the things that's happened all over the world, all kinds of political parties, North and South, is that their elected representatives are not workers. They're not low-income folks. They're lawyers, they're doctors, they're business people. And it's hard to keep in touch with the needs of marginalized folks, economically and otherwise marginalized folks, when your own representatives, your own folks don't feel them. They're that's not part of their life experiences. So I think it's there. I think we're fighting over it. I think that if we could get people like Adam Przeworski to help craft the language of it, it would be a wonderful thing. But I'm less pessimistic about. I'm less of the view that there's no answer, that there's no vision.
And I would just plug work by one of our colleagues, Noam Lupu, who's at Vanderbilt, who has a book about working class representation in the U.S. and some of the barriers to working class representation. We also heard a few weeks ago in one of our sessions from Amanda Littman. Amanda runs Run for Something, which is very much about getting younger people, working class people, to run for office and overcome that psychological barrier. So check that session out. So I did want to move to the Republican Party quickly. And one thing we heard from Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who came on a few weeks ago, was one of the issues is that because of the two-party system, there's no place for pro-democracy Republicans really to defect to. And so we can think of voices, people like Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney, and others who have been publicly oppositional to Trump and have taken great career risks to do so. But it's quite clear there needs to be more elite defection. You see some hints of this. We see Marjorie Taylor Greene, of all people, leading the charge on the Epstein issue. So what is your sense of the Republican coalition right now? Is there a possibility of some sort of split from Trump, especially if the details come out? Epstein or other things?
I'll jump first and give my colleagues here time to think of additional answers. I mean, I would say two things. One, there's a difference between a kind of split in the Republican Party, which would allow Democrats to win, which would given the alignment of the parties right now, would be good news for democracy, but is not a long-term cure for our ailments. The second issue is, to what degree can you have a second political party in the United States wholeheartedly embrace democratic principles and as it did for the most part in the past. So in other words, in order to be a stable democracy, we need to have more than one political party that's committed to democracy. And the task of getting one of our two parties to turn away from authoritarianism, in effect, is something that really we don't have a lot of experience with in the United States. And so and to my only answer is in some ways a kind of weak answer, but I think it's the best. It's a sort of dismal science view of democracy. I mean, the way parties learn is by losing, and there has to be an electoral cost for behaving in a certain way. And so, whether that comes over a repeated series of elections, and I say it's it's not an exciting answer, because whenever you say this, people say, well, we don't have that long to wait, or it's naive to think that the party is going to change. But I think what's even more naive is to think that you can have a democracy with only one party that's fully committed to democracy. So I think that's why you're going back to your previous question. Figuring out how to win elections is really essential. So I mean, I don't know, maybe my other colleagues here have an idea of how a party changes except through election laws. But as far as I can tell, in a democracy, the kind of self-correcting logic of a democracy requires you lose and realize that the road you've gone down is a failed strategy, or at least there's a split over that, and one faction takes over that abandons the path that they've been on. So until that happens, I fear we'll continue to be, we may not be on the precipice of a crisis, but we'll continue to be in a very unsettled place.
I guess I could jump in. A problem with Daniel's correct prescription that sort of the best path towards Republican Party reform is losing is that our electoral institutions favor parties based in sparsely populated territories, and that's the Republican Party. So the Republican Party has an electoral advantage, almost a lock on the Senate, a slighter advantage in the Electoral College. So not only is it harder for the Republicans to lose, it's really hard for them to suffer the kind of electoral drubbing that would allow those incentives to kick in. Just very briefly, I think it's worth distinguishing short term from the long term and answering your question, Rory. I think in the short term, it's as long as Trump remains far and away the most popular figure in the Republican Party, it's very hard for me to imagine anything splitting the party. I think they will continue to be unified behind what is an authoritarian project, and anyone who speaks up will follow the same path that Jeff Flake and Kinzinger and Liz Cheney and others followed. In the longer run, there are multiple ways out. I think the party will be in danger of all kinds of splits post-Trump. Succession is going to be a real issue for this party, and that will create opportunities for the opposition, to be sure. But in terms of, and Daniel's fundamental point is absolutely right, that we cannot survive as a democracy if one party in a two-party system is not committed to playing by democratic rules of the game. And that is where we are now. It's where we're going to be for a little while. And what worries me in terms of sort of you can imagine the party easing back in another direction, but Trump sort of taught folks certain things that can't be unlearned. Trump crossed a bunch of red lines that nobody had ever crossed before in terms of kind of violent and illiberal rhetoric, in terms of breaking rules and violating rules. And he showed Republicans that it works, that they will be rewarded for these violations, and you can't unlearn that. And so, I guess a more specified version of what Danny was saying is Republicans as a class of people have to learn that line crossing will be damaging to their career, will hurt them. And it doesn't seem to me that we're close to that.
Yeah, just to jump in, you're seeing why these two guys are brand name now, Levitsky and Ziblatt. They're totally right, very insightful, completely agree. I'm going to reveal myself, as I always describe myself, as an irritatingly optimistic person, and outline a path that looks a little better than this. But I don't want to say this is what I'm predicting will happen, but it is possible. So Donald Trump is an extremely powerful and in his second term, very effective leader, autocratizing leader. He is also governing in a style that's very familiar to people who study autocracy, pretty much insulated from any kind of counter arguments, wise counselors, people who might say, hey, not such a great idea to threaten Brazil that you're going to impose 50% tariffs because you don't like what's going on in the courts there, when supposedly we're using tariffs for different reasons and it's not going to make a difference anyway. All kinds of decisions where you can see that there's just no one there. There are a bunch of yes men and yes women around him, and no one is there who can constrain him, and that leads to errors and mess ups. And I think what James Carville was saying, going back to Adam's observation, is that the economy is going to fall apart. And when the economy falls apart, that's going to be very, very damaging to Trump and to the administration. And I guess we put an if in front of the economy falling apart because it's been surprisingly resilient so far, but there is a real possibility that will happen. And that's partly because of his governing style. Remember George W. Bush after 9/11 had 80-something% approval ratings, left office under 20%, on the weight of the Iraq War and the Great Recession. These things can change rather quickly. Steve talked about the lock that the Republican Party has on a lot of the kind of more sparsely populated parts of the country. Well, Iowa was a purple, even blue state in living memory of us folks. And it looks like there's some things going on in Iowa, including soy farmers who are really being badly hurt by the tariff policy and by China saying no to U.S. To importing U.S. soy. So there could be. So I think Daniel and Stephen are right. Steve's right that they need to lose, and I think it's not out of the question that they will not only lose but take a total drubbing, which is what it would take to unlearn the lesson that this is a good strategy. Because I agree with Steve. Unless that happens, how can you imagine a future Republican president not, going way past the red lines all over the place, because he or she would look weak in the eyes of their own party if they did not. But it is possible that this whole thing shifts, and part of the story of it shifting would be really bad economic outcomes, which was part of the reason why Trump won the election in 2024.
Adam, would you like to weigh in? No.
Can I just add one quick thing on this?
Please, yeah.
One thing I recently heard Ezra Klein interviewing Ben Shapiro on his show, and one of the things I was interested to hear Ben Shapiro say, it was to express some anxiety about the fact that the Trump administration is creating this very powerful executive, and what happens if Democrats come into office with that now newly empowered executive, and the kind of fear of what could happen after that. So that's a kind of double-edged kind of anxiety, because on the one hand, you might say, well, that could serve as have a constraining impact on some Republicans begin to get worried about what the Trump administration is doing, because they're concerned of, what does this mean if AOC is president and essentially Congress just rubber stamps everything the president does. And so with that future scenario in mind, you sort of say, okay, we better draw back with the ambitions. The flip side of that is that now the stakes are even that much higher. And so then you'll go to the mat to block Democrats from coming into power. So I can see that playing out in two different ways. But in any case, there is some, I guess this gets back to the kind of fear on Weingas kind of thought that there may be some kind of pushback against an overly powerful executive because you think your side may not be in power next time around. But yeah, I don't know how that would play out.
On this, I have a footnote. I think that that's a very important point, namely Republicans, Trump Republicans, are day by day increasing the stakes. Their defeat is becoming more and more costly, and therefore they should be less and less willing to accept it.
And this actually brings me to my final question. We're coming up to our time. I did want to talk a little bit about rebuilding and healing. And one of the themes from Adam's work, among many others, is this idea that sort of the stakes of the game, if the stakes get too high, that can lead to these sorts of power grabs and other things. So I think there's a strategic question for the Democratic Party and for everybody when this moment is over. Is what do the consequences look like? And we can even rewind back to the previous 4 years. Did the Democrats handle that 4-year period properly? It's not a healthy sign. A few of you study Latin America. It's not a healthy sign where if you lose the election, you go to jail, right? And that's a bad. And so how do the Democrats and how does the political system balance this need to lower the temperature, to maybe even lower the stakes, but also holding people accountable for what they do? You've also written, I did want to plug this idea of militant democracy, right? So using democratic processes to eliminate authoritarian political forces in a system that can be seen as contradictory by some people. So what are the kind of principles people should be thinking about for this rebuilding period if and when it does happen?
Rory, really quickly, what do you mean that it's not a healthy sign when if you lose an election, you go to jail? If you lose an election and you tried to overturn it and you go to jail, is that not healthy?
Well, yes. And I think there's this balance between accountability, right? So we want to hold people accountable for their actions. But if the stakes become too high, then that creates an incentive for them to not even hold an election at all, right? And so I agree with you that people need to be held accountable for their actions. But I wonder if there's some sort of, I don't know, this is something I'm struggling with. And Stephen, you study Latin America, you're familiar with these kinds of cases. So what are your reactions?
My reaction is to say I think Sue should go first. She studies Latin America first too. These are really tough questions.
Yeah.
Well, the other side of it is, I think we're dancing around talking about the Bolsonaro decision in Brazil, where the former president, very much in the Democratic backsliding mold, Trump, it was almost a second time farce repeat of January 6th. So they tried to block the transition. His people tried to block the transition. Turns out there was that Bolsonaro was part of a conspiracy, or had something to do with the conspiracy to poison his opponent, the current President Lula, and also tried to instigate a coup d'état. So he was held to account. So yeah, it raises the stakes. You want to stay in power, but it also raises the costs of that kind of behavior. So I don't know how you need to have a legal process. You need to do it in a transparent way. That's what militant democracy is all about. It can't be sort of arbitrary, going after your opponents. But it's one of the most important moments for the rule of law. And I think Steve and I and others looking at Brazil, feeling a little envious about what happened there, that holding it to account.
And I think there's no silver bullet that works at all moments and at all times, because I think, go back to January 2021. At that point, Donald Trump's approval rating was very low. He was discredited. No one wanted to do anything have anything to do with him. When he announced his candidacy, nobody showed up. You remember he presented this in Mar-a-Lago. Media barely covered it. The costs at that point of acting in a more forceful way were pretty low. The benefits would have been enormous. The idea of doing that now, or sort of saying, Democrats right now today saying, if we come back into office, we're going to prosecute Trump and throw him in jail, are enormous. That would certainly raise stakes of democracy very high, and raise stakes of accountability very high. So I think there has to be a kind of subtlety with this. And when the moment is there to act in a way that enforces accountability without having a massive polarizing effect, those moments need to be seized. The paradox, in a certain way, it's exactly because Trump's approval ratings were so low that so many people thought, well, we don't need to deal with this because the problem's already resolved itself. And so the emergency seems to pass, and it's at exactly that moment when it's possible to act, when people sort of say, it's easier not to act. So I think, in a way, the lesson of that is to not to kind of enforce militant democracy all the time, but just to kind of be aware of to take advantages of opportunities for holding somebody accountable. And I think the 4 years of the Biden administration, in a certain way, were a missed opportunity in that respect. But I'm not sure that means now going forward that's what needs to be done, in 2028. I don't know exactly what needs to be done in 2028, but I just wouldn't say we don't automatically use the past as kind of recipe for what needs to happen next.
I mean, I wonder whether the Republicans' current leadership really has to worry or does worry much about this, because Democrats don't really exercise power in that way, and why don't they? Well, I think their constituents don't like it the way some of the MAGA base likes it. So I remember when Joe Biden at one point, I think it was in the 2020 campaign, where he said, I want to take Donald Trump out behind the shed and give him a good whacking or something. And it went over so badly because Democrats don't like that kind of talk. A lot of them, the base is not in favor of, violence, even at the kind of throwaway verbal level.
What's amazing about is that I think most Republicans wouldn't agree with you, though. I mean, they seem to think that Republicans, Democrats are using the deep state against them and so on. So there's this real distrust.
And how much of it is, I don't know that the sophisticated political operators at the top really worry as much about that. I don't think they worry about it as much as Democrats do. And rightfully so. I mean, we're going to face this problem if it ever comes to be with the Supreme Court. And Democrats have been weighing, and analysts and legal scholars and so forth have been weighing different ideas about this. And there are sort of so-called hardball solutions and more moderate solutions. My own feeling is that this is just going to be a case-by-case issue, and we're always going to be weighing the fact that hardball is sometimes it has some benefits, like maybe having a Supreme Court that's going to be functional again as an ongoing institution, but there also is going to be a cost in terms of the democratic credentials of the actors who instigate such things, and we're going to have to come out in different places on different particular issues of this kind. Some of our colleagues have written about the importance of sort of moderation and institutional respectful institutional responses, and clearly the opposition in Venezuela made a big mistake when it backed a coup. And you can hold up the Colombian opposition in Congress was brilliant at using parliamentary tactics to slow things down when Uribe was trying to harden his hold on democracy. But there's so many other situations where it's just not clear, and it's just going to be a case-by-case tough set of decisions.
I think Poland is probably a case that we need to be watching closely and learning from, because it's the closest example I can think of a defeat of a liberal political force that had politicized the state to a significant degree, and an effort by a more liberal democratic coalition to deal with that, and going through this very debate instead of dilemmas. To what extent do you use hardball tactics to undo damage done by a previous illiberal party? I think the U.S. case is going to be more extreme than the Polish case. I see Adam is chomping at the bit, so I'm going to defer to him on this. But the Polish case is one we can hopefully learn from.
No, I agree. It's just, once you get this kind of polarization, it's very hard to come back, because there's nobody who's nonpartisan. Yes, I mean, ideally, yes, you would want to get people who are technically proficient, competent, and not overtly partisan. But once you polarize everything to the extent to which peace government did, there's just no way out. So restoring a status quo is not simple.
Well, we have 5 minutes left, and I promised we would end on a positive note, so we do need to follow that with something. I wanted to ask you all, this is a question I've been asking most people who come on, is what would your advice be to American citizens or citizens elsewhere in the world who are facing these sorts of governments? A lot of people are concerned. They're probably watching this because they share some of your concerns, but there's a feeling of powerlessness. We know from Havel and others that there is power in the powerless. So what would your advice be to American citizens as they think about how they can contribute? Sue, I'm going to start with you.
I'm seeing Adam looking like he's going to have a null set answer to that question. Look, I could be glib and say that I've taken up gardening in recent months as like figure out ways to distract yourself, self-care, all that kind of stuff. But I do think that I have found personally that working with other people to get things done that you can get done that are on some scale helpful in pushing back and teaching and setting realistic small goals. We're going to be part of a protest. We're going to get folks out. It is, maybe it's just a feel good thing, but it really is helpful to not feel alone in these kinds of circumstances. There are many millions of people, probably a majority, honestly, of the U.S. population that is deeply concerned about some aspects of what we're seeing going on. Look at what's happened to public opinion about the immigration issue. There's still a lot of public support for the idea of control over the borders. There is not nearly as much public support, not majority public support for sure, about the kind of deportation policies, the heavy hand of ICE. And we just had a case in the Chicago suburbs of a man who was awakened at 6 a.m. to hear his door being broken down, and he turned out to be a U.S. citizen, but it didn't matter. They arrested him anyway. People see that and learn about it, and they have the kind of reaction you would hope human beings would have, and that's happening. And so knowing that's true and working together, especially kind of face-to-face working together with people on these issues, we're not going to have big effects at the federal level when we work in our neighborhoods and our cities and towns and so on. But I do think that collective action of various forms is a kind of antidote to a feeling of hopelessness.
So we're going to go in this order: Adam, and then Steve, and then Daniel. So Adam, you're on.
So I don't have advice, I never have advice, but I do have a dream, and that is, I think what we need desperately is some kind of a positive vision of the country. We need some kind of a positive vision of an alternative to what's going on now and to the conditions which brought the current state about. I think we should do more than protest, resist. We propose something. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's feasible. I don't know who's going to do it. But we need some vision of an alternative future. Without it, I think we're done.
So without disagreeing at all with what Adam just said, I think in the nearer term for everyday citizens, and caveat, if you do come up with a vision out, by all means, tell somebody. But if you don't, and most days I wake up and I don't have that vision, I think it's, in all seriousness, I think it's really important that citizens remain engaged. And there are literally thousands of different ways to be engaged. But people have to be out following politics and hopefully engaged with other human beings in organizations on some issue. And I don't want to be too glib, but it doesn't even matter all that much what the issue is. There are many issues, whether it's immigration or corruption or civil rights and trans rights or economic policy or abortion. There are many, many others. But being engaged and being part of some kind of collective effort to push back on the hundreds and thousands of fronts where pushback is needed. If we have 20 million Americans actively engaged in pushing back, that that is going to make a difference. We don't know, we never know in anticipation which strategy is going to succeed. What we need to be collectively throwing a lot of spaghetti at the walls and to see what works. But we can't get there. We can't find something that works if we're not all out there actively engaged, pushing back, and experimenting. So don't stay home.
Yeah, so I think all three of these messages are really very much related because, and kind of what Steve in a certain way is saying is don't act like you're David Axelrod or, a political consultant as just a citizen, meaning try to figure out what's going to be the winning message. I mean, figure out the issues that motivate you and that concern you. And don't kind of edit yourself and say, oh, well, that's not a winning issue. If things are making you outraged, then, talk to other people about it. And I think, to take up Sue's point, if that means having a reading group where you just talk to other friends, that's a form of activism. If it means doing something more than that, that's great too. But I think, in a way, talking about these issues is in itself is something. And then in terms and with Adam's point, I think, this does add up to an alternative. That's where do alternative visions come from, but exactly out of this kind of orientation where you're willing to talk to different people, talk about different things, and we kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom in effect. And I do think, I guess one thing I would add to what others have said is that I do think focusing on this kind of counter institutions in the sense of, in the places where people live, figuring out what works there and sort of trying to create a civilized place where we live, and in a sense, we're fighting for democracy, but we're also defending kind of decent way of life and civilization itself. And so I think thinking about is there something better to offer that we can draw on in our own communities? And that's where in the American political system, at least the federal system, that's where the ideas come from, are in the places where people live. And so even if you live in a blue state where you feel like, well, there's nothing I can do at my local level, no, trying to improve things at your local level, this is where the good ideas come from. And this is where, Adam's sort of, I think, big idea of like a better future, that's where it comes from. It comes from everyday lived experience in the places where we live. So I think staying engaged at the local level and at the state level is really important as well.
Well, thank you all for that. I also wanted to point to Sue's point about gardening, which she said as a throwaway, but I actually think mental health is really important. There's this balance between staying engaged, but also not being demoralized. And I think authoritarian governments thrive on apathy and demoralization. And so figuring out ways to strike that balance and keep some optimism where you can, I think is important. So thank you all to these four speakers for coming today. It was really an honor for me to get to interact with people I've been admiring and reading for so long. Thank you to the audience, those of you who have come week after week to these sessions. It's been appreciated. I will be continuing this moving forward, most likely in an asynchronous format, in a podcast of some kind. So I'll be in touch about that. But thank you again for coming, and best wishes.